And I'm about to go into Vulkan now, so this is a good segue. So we've been looking in OpenGL all this time, and before I switch over to Vulkan, one thing you will want to probably tear off and keep up while you're working is this rasterization settings menu. And I'm going to turn everything off that's currently on. And I guess it won't let me turn that one off. Okay, I'm going to switch from OpenGL to Vulkan. Okay, let me do that again. So should be the same look, OpenGL, switch to Vulkan. And mind you, there are some materials that don't look the same, or there's some limitations like with substance materials and layered materials and things, but for the most part, it should look the same. And OpenGL will be phased out, not immediately. You'll have some time, but you might want to focus on updating your libraries to Vulkan. OpenGL is 20-year-old technology. No new development is being made on it, so that's kind of the reasoning why behind we're switching. In addition to that, you can get much closer to the look of CPU, GPU true ray tracing, physical accuracy, by turning on some things like ray trace reflections. So as soon as I turn this on, and by the way, I haven't benchmarked it myself, but I heard that Vulkan is 20 times faster in some scenarios they were testing, so it's not slower. Of course, as you add some of these, I'll call them add-ons on, it might slow down things a little bit, but in my working, I didn't notice at all. And it's worth being aware that these are not truly ray traced effects. They are more simulations getting you closer to true ray trace effects. So without ray trace reflections on, we don't get that reflection in the mirror and body side. But as soon as we turn them on, and this is excellent, I think, for VR, especially for rear view mirrors and all that missing information, you're going to get a lot closer to what you're expecting to see in reality. So there is the ray trace reflections, there is refractions, which is not a ray trace effect, it's more of an effect. I'll show you that in a few minutes. And then there's these real-time environment shadows. And for these, you have a few different options. With off, of course, you got no shadows. And then with screen space ambient occlusion, this is based on the screen or the render port. So if something is not in the render scene, it's no longer affecting what's in the render scene. I'll show you an example of that in a moment. And it's lower quality than the ray traced version, which is the next one up, ray traced ambient occlusion. So for the screen space, if you have a smaller window, it's going to be a lower quality. And for ray traced ambient occlusion, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter the size of the window, it's still going to be the better quality. And then you can change things like the shadow intensity, and there's a few options in there. And then there's ray trace environment shadows, which takes into account your EXR HDRI that's on the dome. In this case, I've got the sun, and so whatever the lightest pixels are in that image, it's going to cast light in that direction with this environment shadows option selected from the dropdown. All right, so I'm going to go through some of the limitations. I don't mean to be a downer, but if I were in your shoes, I would want to know what to expect and what I might run into and what I might do to try to avoid some things, set expectations so you're not thinking it's going to look like a true ray traced rendering, which would be under here CPU or GPU ray tracing. It's just a whole lot closer than it was with OpenGL. So again, if we switch back and forth between OpenGL and Vulkan, right now they look identical. But once you start turning on ray trace reflections and refractions, then it's going to look a lot better and a lot closer to realism with these effects that are more like a poster added on to the raster. These are all rasterized effects, I should say. They're not truly ray traced. But when comparing that to the CPU ray tracing, you can see it is different, but it's not as different as it was when we only had the option of OpenGL. And with this, where is it? Go back to Vulkan. With the ray trace reflections, you can affect the transparency layers. So you can see it goes up to like maybe the first 6 bumps, you'll see a different. One limitation of Vulkan is that you're only going to get one bounce. And by bounce, what I mean is in your render settings under ray tracing quality, there's this trace depth. And right now it's set to 2. So that's, I think you get 1 bounce for reflective transparent and 1 bounce for reflective opaque. So in Alias, you're stuck with only 1 bounce. So that's another good reason to move over to VRED at some point if you want to get some visualization, because you get more realism with more bounces. But like I said, Vulkan is limited to 1 basically. So depending on your scenario, 1 or 2. So again, going back to OpenGL, these are mirrors that have chrome on them. We're not seeing anything reflected. Going to Vulkan, same look until you turn on the ray trace reflections. And then I'm going to turn on the shadows, ray traced environment shadows as well. So it's comparable to the CPU, but the difference is, and I'll go back and forth, you'll look, is that we're not getting the reflections of these spheres in the reflection of the mirror. That's in the little mirror, that's in the reflection of the big mirror. And we're not getting the reflections on the spheres themselves. So when I switch to CPU, you can see there's a difference, but not much better still than OpenGL, I think. So there are some limitations that have to do with transparent objects, materials on objects. So I'm in Vulkan right now, and I've got this chess piece, and we do see the reflection. This is a chrome, like a mirror, so we do see the reflection and the shadow. Sometimes when you add transparency to the material, you start losing shadows because of the 1 bounce limitation. I'm actually surprised that I'm seeing this. But if that does happen to you, there are a few workarounds. Obviously, you could choose to go to CPU or GPU ray tracing. Sorry, I didn't realize I had bake shadows. That's why if you keep that rasterization settings window open, then you can keep looking at where you are. Again, with this plastic material, I'm going to go back to where it was opaque. But as soon as I make it transparent, sometimes you'll lose either the reflection, or you'll lose the shadow, or you'll lose your both, depending on the scenario because of the 1 bounce limit. But the workarounds are you could turn on baked shadows, so you'd have to pre-calculate them. The other thing, I'm going to open a different scene. I don't have to spend time looking for the perfect setup to show you this. Going back to that material, if I turn on use texture and I have a cutout transparency and use alpha on, and this image is just a white and clear, just stripes. So I am able to get the correct shadowing with transparency using this workaround. So it might work in some scenarios. I think it might have to be all or nothing. I don't know if it'll work with a degree of transparency. In my test, it didn't. So let me open up another scene. And we're talking about that limitations with screen space and shadows. So here I have this chess piece, and if I look at the type of shadows, if I put it on screen space ambient occlusion shadows, and I'm going to make the shadow really dark so just so you can see what I'm doing here. And if I move this out of screen, let me get real close. Okay, so it's still in screen right now, but as soon as I move it out, the shadow will pop off. It'll pop on and pop off as soon as that chess piece that's casting the shadow leaves the screen, then you're going to lose that effect. And that's just something I want you to be aware of, especially if you're doing animations. Might be better to switch to ray traced ambient occlusion. So even if I move this, let me go to my transform because I've run out of room of this object. Even if I move it off screen, it's still going to cast that shadow. So I have one more thing to show you that has to do with Vulkan, and that has to do with refractions. Okay, so I've got the scene here, and I'm in Vulkan with none of the rasterization settings enabled. And I've got two planes here. One is the yellow one has a index of refraction of 1.33, and the blue one has 1.58. So when you look through these, if you turn on your refractions, you can see that in Vulkan, I do get an effect. And it's not bad. I just want you to know that looking through these individually, you'll get somewhat realistic, semi-realistic results. But when you look through both of them, it's only going to take into account the surface or with the material that's closest to the camera. So at a glance, they're like, oh, okay, it's got refraction. But if I go and look at realistically with CPU ray tracing, you're going to see that in the square where I'm looking through both planes, the refraction is going to look a bit different than what we were seeing in Vulkan. But it's still better than OpenGL, more realistic, where you didn't have any refraction at all. Yeah, that's why I think I keep encouraging you to use both apps, because there are things that you're limited to an Alias where just opening up the same file in VRED, you can get much better results without any prep or barely any prep. All right, so let me just make sure I think I talked about the limitations for the live referencing between both apps. So like we were just talking about why there would be an advantage to moving over to VRED to use Vulkan. Great one-stop shop for someone who's not as versed in the UI as some more seasoned users, especially designers, surfacers. They could set up a quick render without a lot of upskilling. And you can't reproduce the accuracy, the realistic accuracy in Alias that you can get with VRED. And especially now that the materials can look the same in both, it's easy to know what to expect when you're working in Alias, when you use those VRED shaders. And when the surfacer or visualization person opens it in VRED, then there's no surprises. I think it'll be really helpful, especially since the Viz person won't know what surfaces should have what materials or shaders. That if the Alias person sets that up, then there's no questions, because maybe it didn't look the same before. Now it can look the same, and you can verify that before even handoff. I didn't go over it, but there's a new tool called Line Tube Radius in Vulkan. If you import curves, and I think this would be great for cut lines. So like sometimes they're not built in early review stages. You could just bring the curves in, and then in render, you could give them dimension. So of course, VR, XR reviews, yeah, it works with variants and everything as usual. And then there's some effects like the fog and the lens flares, chromatic aberration, and the volumetric rendering. I don't know if you have had a chance to play with that, but there's a lot more you can do to create emotional renders in VRED that you can't do as well in Alias. There's the render guide, which we went over. It sounds like you might be excited to use that. And then there's an improvement with the world space texture transforms. Before, if you had a material with paint flake, for example, and it was assigned to a surface and then you rescaled that surface, it didn't scale with it. So you might have gigantic paint flakes. Like if you brought something in and scaled it up, now it should be more consistent with the scaling. Also, it handles large complex scenes, another reason to start migrating over to Vulkan from OpenGL. Should be faster, more realistic with those rasterized effects. Call that a hybrid ray tracing approach. No light limit like in OpenGL. You can have more lights than we were limited. And also that really slowed things down in VR, like it would just kill it. So I haven't tested it in VR, but I hope it is performance better. I didn't show you in the rasterized settings, but there is occlusion culling, which does some work behind the scenes by increasing performance. It's disregarding some objects that you can't see because they're hidden behind other objects. The shadows I showed you have 3 dynamic options, and by dynamic I should mention that when we baked shadows before, they were stuck in that position. So if you had a turntable or a door opening, then you were stuck with the shadow in that one direction. But these shadows in Vulkan are dynamic, so as things move or animate, then the shadows will update and move with them. Again, more realism. The refractions is the visual effect that we didn't have in OpenGL, and now displacement maps are faster and more accurate. So a few things not supported in Vulkan currently are fog, geometry lights. They don't cast light, but you can see them reflected on other surfaces. There's a limit to the clusters, and the multipass and layered materials or anything when you're looking at opaque reflective materials with a transparent reflective material in front of it, you're going to have some limitations with that one light bounce. There are some stipulations for your hardware, GPUs, your graphics cards that will not work with the AMD. It might disable your environment shadows if that's what you have. Won't have surface analysis mode where you could before analyze your surface quality in VRED, similar to the like the black and white shaders you have with the stripes in Alias. Non-photorealistic materials are not supported, nor is subsurface scattering. And for ordering transparent objects that you're looking through them, we do have depth peeling, and it is correct, but it is slower and it might produce some artifacts. And we don't have variable rate shading, excuse me, which is something you'd turn on if you had a moire effect. And the denoiser can't be used with Vulkan. I think it's not advised to, the DLSS, you can turn it on, but I think it does not do you any favors.